I spent 7 months backpacking around in 6 different countries in Australia and Southeast Asia, and I spent a total of 18,026 US dollars. Well, let's break it down. Hello and welcome to a new video. If you're new here, my name is Nera, and back at the end of 2022 and during a good chunk of 2023, I went on a pretty cool solo backpacking trip. I documented a lot of it, and all of those videos are here on my channel if you haven't seen them already. But in today's video, we are going to talk about money. Now, you already know the full amount that I spent on this entire trip, but I thought it would be interesting to go over each of the countries separately to get a better understanding of where the money went, and so that you could get a better idea of what it could look like if you want to plan a trip to any of these countries. So we'll go over the different countries in the same order that I visited them and go into more detail about how much I spent in each of them. As for transportation between the different countries, I will cover that as well, but I'll do that a little bit later in the video. Also, just for clarification, all the amounts in this video will be in US dollars. So, the first country that I went to was Australia. I started off in Melbourne and traveled up the east coast all the way to Cairns with a bunch of stops along the way. I was there for 70 days and spent a total of $6,881, which makes about $98 a day. I've divided my spendings into different categories, and as you can see here on the chart, almost half of my Australia budget was spent on tours. Now, all of them weren't necessarily what I would classify as a tour, but I figured it made the most sense to put them all together as they were all quite big expenses that went towards sort of big activities or experiences. So these tours were basically an 11-day surf camp package, as well as a 4-day music festival during New Year's, a Fraser Island tour, as well as a scuba diving course, which included 3 days living on a boat. So those were sort of the big tours that I did during my stay in Australia. Moving on, the smallest piece on this chart, as well as on all the other ones, is alcohol. Personally, I don't really drink a lot, but I wanted to include it here because I think it's one of the things that can be good to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out your budget for an upcoming trip. If you're someone who likes to go out a lot and drink, and especially in Australia, since I found the alcohol there to be quite expensive. Now, as for accommodation, I only stayed in hostels and found most of them through Hostel World. The prices would vary quite a lot from city to city, and also depending on how far in advance I managed to book my accommodation, with my cheapest accommodation being $15 a night in Melbourne, and my most expensive accommodation being $49 a night in Byron Bay. Moving on to transportation. Before actually going to Australia, I bought a 60-day Greyhound bus ticket for $283, which would allow me to take the Greyhound buses between the different cities as much as I wanted to within 60 days of activating my ticket. You can, of course, also just buy the individual tickets for each bus, but I found this to be very convenient as it allowed me to book and rebook and cancel as many buses as I wanted to without having to worry about sort of the prices or refunds or anything like that. Other than the Greyhound ticket, I did also have to pay for a train ride to and from Apollo Bay, as well as some local buses, a few Ubers, and a domestic flight from Brisbane to Cairns. The domestic flight was never actually a part of my original plan. I wanted to take a Greyhound bus for that distance as well, but because of some extreme flooding during that time, the roads were closed and that flight was actually my only option of getting up north. So it's always good to be prepared for the sort of unpredictable and have a buffer in your budget so that you can handle whatever situation you might find yourself in, because odds are not everything is going to go as planned, and that's just part of it. Moving on to food, I found that most hostels that I stayed in Australia had very well-equipped kitchens, and eating out was quite expensive. So for the most part, I just bought groceries in the stores and cooked my own food at the hostels. And on occasions, I would, of course, treat myself and go out for some dinner or something as well. But mainly, I try to cook my own food and just buy groceries in the store. The last category here on the chart is other, and as you can probably guess, it's pretty much just everything that doesn't fit into any of the other categories. So it's everything from sunscreen and SIM cards to surfboard rentals, bungee jumping, river rafting, and laundry. Literally everything that doesn't fit into any of the other categories. And that was it for Australia. The next country that I visited was Thailand, and during this trip I actually went there twice. So the first time around, I started off in Chiang Mai in the north and made my way down south, visiting quite a few different islands along the way. And the second time around, I just stayed on Koh Samui for a week. So in total, I was in Thailand for 53 days and spent a total of $2,360, which makes about $45 a day. My accommodation in Thailand was a mix of hostels and guest houses and some private bungalows, and most of it was found on either Agoda or Booking.com, with the cheapest one being a hostel room in Pai for $6 a night and the most expensive one being a guest house in Koh Phangan for $21 a night. I did travel around quite a lot while I was in Thailand, so the transportation costs cover some different buses and boats, an overnight train, as well as some scooter rentals and gas money. Now, as opposed to Australia, where I cooked most of my meals myself, while I was in Thailand, I pretty much did no cooking at all, except for this one cooking class that I went to. And I'm very happy with that because holy shit, the food there is so good. It would have been an actual waste if I didn't take any chance I could get to just stuff my face with local Thai food. It was also very affordable to eat out, so that's what I did while I was in Thailand. The last category here is quite big, but it also includes some bigger expenses, such as the tour I did at an ethical elephant sanctuary, the cooking class that I mentioned, as well as some fun dives, a little tattoo, a new day bag, a pair of shoes, some new jewelry, and quite a few Thai boxing classes. And that was it for Thailand. After that, I went to Malaysia, where I started off in Langkawi, then traveled around on mainland for a bit, and finished off on Borneo. I was in Malaysia for 25 days and spent a total of $949, which makes about $38 a day. For accommodation, I mostly used Agoda and Booking.com here as well, and mainly stayed in hostels but had to splurge on a hotel for my last 2 nights, with the hostels averaging at around $7 and the hotel being $20 a night. As you can see, the transportation portion of the chart is pretty big in relation to the other parts, and that is because I took a domestic flight from Kuala Lumpur to Borneo, which cost me about $98, and the rest of the transportation money was spent on buses, boats, and grabs. While I was in Malaysia, I spent a whole week at a hostel in Cameron Highlands where they actually had a pretty decent kitchen. So during my time there, I did do a little bit of cooking, but other than that, I went out to eat for the most part. While I was in Borneo, I also did some more scuba diving and actually ended up getting my advanced certificate, which cost me around $187, which explains why the last category is pretty big here as well. In Malaysia, I also spent a total of $43 on cash withdrawal fees, and that's also something that's good to keep in mind when traveling around in Southeast Asia. A lot of the times it is preferred to pay with cash, although when withdrawing it, you usually have to pay some kind of fee. So I tended to kind of just withdraw the largest amount of cash that I felt comfortable having on me. I then kept most of it locked away in my main bag at the hostels and just walked around with whatever I thought I would need for the day. After Malaysia, I spent 18 days in Indonesia and pretty much only visited Bali, Lombok, and Gili Air. I spent a total of $789, which makes about $44 a day. Accommodation was once again mainly found on Agoda and Booking.com, and those two are definitely the main ones that I used while traveling around in Southeast Asia. Transportation was relatively cheap and easy to come by. You could order a Grab in most places, and the hostel would usually help you out if you needed to book a boat or a bus or something else. As for food, I was once again mainly eating out and didn't really do any cooking at all. In Bali, however, I do feel like the sort of restaurants and cafes were quite westernized, which of course also made them a bit more expensive. So if you are on a budget, I'd suggest trying to find some of the more local and low-key restaurants, since they tend to be a bit cheaper and honestly, in my opinion, just as good, if not better. For the last category, I spent $140 on a 2-day mountain trek going up Mount Rinjani on Lombok, and the rest of the money in that category was mostly spent on surfboard rentals, as well as a ring making workshop, a little bit of shopping, and the visa that I got on arrival. Now, the next country that I went to was definitely the most expensive one on this trip, but it's also a country I really wanted to go to, so I might have done a little bit of splurging while I was there, and I am of course talking about Japan. I was there for 21 days and spent a total of $2,439, which averages to about $116 a day. This is also where I met up with one of my best friends from back home. So in terms of accommodation, we did stay in some hostels, but for some of the places that we went to, it was actually cheaper for us to rent and split the cost of a guest house or a double room, with the average cost for me being around $23 per night. We traveled around a lot, starting off in Tokyo and making our way down to Fukuoka with a lot of stops along the way, and we did most of that with the 21-day JR pass that we bought in advance for $520. This worked pretty similar to the Greyhound Pass that I had in Australia. So for the 21 days that we spent in Japan, we were able to book, cancel, and rebook onto most of the JR trains that ran through the country. Again, you can of course book and pay for all the trains separately, and I'm not entirely sure how much it would have ended up costing in comparison to what we paid for the 21-day pass. But both me and my friend kind of just agreed on the fact that it was nice not having to worry about booking and paying for all the individual train tickets and just having one ticket that we can use for most of our transportation. The food in Japan was incredible, so we obviously had to eat out a lot, but we also had a ridiculous amount of delicious 7-Eleven and Family Mart dinners. As for other things, like I said, I did do a little bit of splurging while I was in Japan, getting some things for myself, as well as some gifts and souvenirs for family and friends back home, since this was one of my last countries that I was going to. Me and my friend also went to Universal Studios, which cost around $70, and I got another tattoo, which was just under $200. So yeah, I did spend quite a lot of money there, but at that point in my travels, I could also tell that I had a lot more left in my savings than I initially thought I would, so I figured it was okay. The last country that I went to was South Korea, and this was also while still traveling with my friend. We were there for 19 days and spent a total of $1,868, which makes about $98 per day. The accommodation situation was the same here as it was in Japan, so we stayed in a few hostels and some double rooms as well and paid an average of $28 per night. While being in South Korea, we visited 3 different places. So we started off in Busan, then we went to Jeju Island and finished off in Seoul. Now these 3 places are connected by different trains and ferries, although they are quite far apart from each other, and we didn't really feel like spending so much of our last weeks on long travel days. So we actually ended up deciding to fly between the 3 places, as it was obviously a lot quicker and surprisingly cheap as well. I spent around $78 in total for the 2 domestic flights, and other than that, we also rented a car on Jeju Island for 2 days, which was another $78. The rest of the transportation money was spent on gas, as well as local buses within the cities. We ate pretty similarly to how we ate in Japan, and as for the last category, I might have splurged a little here as well, since it was our last destination. I got a suitcase for the trip home. We went bungee jumping and shopping and did a few more activities, and that was it. Now, what I didn't include in these charts is the transportation that I had to take between the different countries. So here's a list of that. Obviously for flights, it's usually cheaper the earlier you book it, but at the same time, while traveling the way that I did, I didn't necessarily know when I'd want to leave or fly to the next place. So I did find that to be a bit difficult, and so it kind of resulted in some very long travel days with awkward layovers. But honestly, I'd much rather do it that way, leaving me with some more flexibility and freedom than having planned and pre-booked everything in advance. As you can see, I also traveled from Thailand to Malaysia and from Japan to South Korea by boat, and I would highly recommend doing that whenever possible. It was, as you can see, extremely cheap and honestly just a really comfortable experience, not having to deal with airports and gates and boarding and stressing over your little carry-on bag being very much over the allowed weight limit. So yeah, that was everything I spent on my 7-month backpacking trip. Like I said, a total of $18,026 US. Now, I really hope this video was helpful in some ways. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below. And other than that, thank you for watching. If you want to see more of this, stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. $2,439. $2,439, and spent a total of $2,349. That was not the amount I was supposed to say. I think that's it. Are we done? Can we be done? I want to be done. Okay, bye.